So when we look at measures, so on to the next slide, one of the things that we're highlighting here is actually defining the key performance indicators that you're using. So these are the measures of success. These are the measures of showing what, regarding to your process or your activity, how will you actually define that? So one way in which we look at doing these, and again, going back to making these really clear, making these really specific, is to, when you're developing your key performance indicators, is to make them SMART. So this is talking about making it specific, making it measurable, making sure it's something that's actually achievable, making sure is it relevant back to your overall project aim and goal, but then also time bound. Have you actually stated by when and where would you actually, would these improvements, would these successes be shown? So when you think about specific, a tip that we have is around using action words. So when you look at your overall goal, you're thinking, is it to improve? Is it to review? Is it to increase? Is it to decrease? Is it to deliver? I think using those action words, even defining your KPIs is really important. When you're thinking about your measures, so is it measurable, for example, how will you know when you've reached your goal? So by so-and-so date, when you've reached a certain number, when you've reached certain attendance, when you've seen a certain number of feedback, how exactly will you know that you've reached your goal? Like, what does that look like for you? Have you been able to define that? And you're given an opportunity to define that now. When you think about achievable, specifically, you want to think about, do you have the skills? Do you have the resources? Do you have to actually make this particular goal achievable? Recognizing if it's something that is very sort of like big picture, or if it's something that's actually really, really something that you're hoping to achieve as a direct result of this. So one thing we'll do is actually just using a rating scale, just actually thinking about how confident you feel on the outcome that you've set out for this particular goal. When you think about if it's relevant, so again, keeping about how you define your KPIs. So going back to on a scale of 1 to 10, how relevant is this goal to your overall project? Because as you start to scope out the different ways in which you can actually try and meet your overall goal, you'll see that you have a number of different smaller goals under that big bucket. So identifying where should you be focusing your attention, how relevant is it to the overall big picture? And in that time bound, last bit again, so it's going back to stating when will it be shown, if there are any milestones that exist, actually putting pen to paper and plotting that down, or actually having a discussion to say perhaps there are no milestones in between, it's a start and end type of project. There are different ways to develop your KPIs and actually start thinking about your overall goal. We know that you have an understanding of why your project and the purpose of it, but one thing you can use is your driver diagrams will actually help you break down that high level goal into specific, smaller, well-defined goals that underpin your project. And we know there's a driver diagram which you can do that. So going from that overall big picture, high level goal to just smaller bits that are more achievable, and you can plot out specific measures against each of those. That will actually help you as you're breaking down and looking at what measures for each one, so you can come up with multiple measures rather than just perhaps a few that look at all the overall goals. So there'll be overall multiple ways in which you can actually measure success by multiple ways by measuring success by actually breaking down your overall goal into smaller bits. And one way to do that is using a diagram. But you may also have done that as part of when you develop your logic model. So when you're thinking about your short-term outcomes, your long-term outcomes, perhaps you thought about ways in which you can break down your overall goal. So using that as a starting point again to think about smaller bite-sized pieces, bite-sized goals that you're trying to achieve as part of this overall big picture. And one thing I covered in the last bit, but also want to go into bit here is around, what balancing measures are you using, for example. Is there a way in which you can use to helpfully sort of demonstrate, for example, whether or not this project has this project itself, has it had an effect in other areas of the system, other parts of the community, other areas of the business, for example? Can you see, has it improved at the cost of another, or has an improvement here also seen an improvement elsewhere? What are the sort of adjoining areas, adjoining systems, adjoining projects, adjoining communities can be connected as a result of this project or initiative that you're putting in place here? So going back to what we want you to do here is we're thinking about sort of SMART goals. So for example, you want to think of a goal which could be around reducing the number so you're thinking about here about hospital-acquired infections. So an example of how we can make this SMART, so we're using that S and making it specific, again, is using that action word, right? So to increase, to reduce, to improve, to do this. So for example, it could be around when it's related to hospital-acquired infections, we're talking about we want to reduce the number of hospital-acquired infections. When we talk about also want to make it specific. So, you know, which hospital? Want to make it very specific. So we're saying whilst you're an inpatient, and you're ensuring that also by the service complies with the hand hygiene and the antibiotic prescribing regimes. So making it really, really specific about what it is that you want to do. Now, overall, it could be that that overall goal is around that hospital-acquired infections, but the specific smaller goal could be focused around that. So we've got that objective, and we've made it specific. We've put in an action word, but then you're going to the next level. We'll be saying, how will I measure that? You know, are there different ways in which I can measure that number of patients with acquired infections whilst they're an inpatient? We've seen a change in that. So one way, and what we're going to ask you to actually think of one quantifiable way and one qualitative way to actually put that into practice. So it could be around a simple one, could be for qualitative, could be around interviews, it could be around comments, it could be around interviewing patients, it could be engaging with the nurses, for example. How will you actually populate that, put down to paper and capture those thoughts and opinions and ideas? But then also it could be around, if you're thinking about quantitative, I think a straightforward one could be around actually just looking at the number of particular cases where the infection has been seen. And then we talk about how to make it attainable. How do you make it achievable? How do you see if it's relevant? And that's a simple scorecard, right? So on a scale of 1 to 10, scale of 1 to 10 for both of them. But then for that last bit around timescale, by when will you be collecting the data point? By when will you expect to be able to see the changes that you're seeing? And then going back and saying, if you set a particular target whereby you want to reduce the number of patients that are acquiring infections by 10%, by 20%, for example, by when do you expect to see that? So is it, you know, the end of the year? Is it by March 2024? Is it by the end of the month? And will you also be tracking for each of those? So what we want to do now is actually giving you an opportunity to go back and say, for the projects that you're currently working on, and if you've already made a start, then that's absolutely fantastic. So this is about getting ideas from other people in your group to help you evolve that a little bit further. But if you haven't, actually start thinking about and going into and say, for specifically, for example, brainstorm 1, 2, 3 measures of success. What indicators of success for your particular project? And then we want you to go through and say, for at least one of those during the time that we have, go through and make it SMART. You know, how will you make that specific? Is it to increase? Is it to decrease? Is it to improve? Try and keep your sentences as simple as possible, and just being able to actually state it in a sentence. Is that what is it specifically you're trying to achieve? And then for that particular specific objective that you've stated, come up with one quantitative and one qualitative measure for each of them. In the next slide, we'll show this specifically. And then we want you to go through and say, how achievable is this? How relevant is this? And by when? When do you think you'll be able to achieve this? That's specifically what we want you to do in the next activity. So it'll be a build on what you've done already. So if you didn't have time to actually present to your team, you can start to now actually plot out these thinking, and then Sue and I will be in the breakouts with you just to go through your thinking and share any ideas around how you can evolve that as well. So on to the next slide. We will give you 15 minutes for this to actually do the activity, and then we'll come back and do a 5-minute brief and just hearing what everyone's sharing. If there's any particular person that wants to share in the group, we'll have an opportunity to do that. And what you can do is leverage sort of the community to get some further ideas on that. What we'll be doing as part of being in the rooms with you will help you sort of evolve or share our thoughts about your current approach. So the idea is that at least you'll be able to have at least one. If you can get through one, that would be ideal. But then if you're able to come up with multiple objectives and plot through the SMART, make them SMART for each one, that would be great. But if we start with one, we'll be able to do that. So this is just an example here about the driver diagrams. This is the way to go from that overall big objective to that smaller objective to actually break it down and make it more piecemeal. But on the next slide, we'll just go through actually generating specific indicators for you. So we're going to share these with you, these questions with you as we go into the breakout sessions. But was there anything else you wanted to add, Ella, before we put everyone back into their breakout rooms?
No, I think you've covered it perfectly. I will send everyone to their breakout rooms. They'll be the same groups as you were in before, so hopefully you can kind of build on the discussion that you were having already. If there's not any questions, I will send everybody now and see you all back in the main room in 15 minutes.